Gita.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And so today, you're not just going to be sharing with us some of the ideas and findings of, from your research around the transmission of intergenerational trauma, but also a practice as well. And I thank you for that, for including also a practice piece that involves art. So, hey, hello, Cheryl, welcome. And I'm taking a moment just to welcome you as well, Cheryl, and inviting you to both tune into our field, take a moment to arrive, and also to check in. We're going to be recording so that we can have this available for other people in our field who can also learn from Gita and hopefully also do the practice that she's going to lead us through. So, and we'll go on for an hour and 25 minutes, 24 minutes, and then we'll have the meeting for the Research 2.0 group right after that. So without further ado, Gita, would you like to take it away?
Hi, everybody. Also, I'm going to mention that before the practice, which is going to be about poetry writing, uh, I'm going to give some time for questions at that point rather than at the end. So after I do the presentation before the practice, I'll very short question and answer period that I've worked in. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Now, I'm going to move everybody over so I can see my screen. Can everybody see this okay? Okay. So we're going to talk about something that actually has not been talked about too much, and that's about inherited memory and knowing the unknown. It's something that I've been, well, funnily enough, I can say I've been interested in it since I was 4 years old, and you'll see later why I say that. We will go on, and I'm feeling very lucky today and to be here and to have found my way into this subject, because it's helped me close a lot of loops in my life and questions. Oh, I have to scroll. So the concept that we've all talked about with generational trauma is very interesting, and I like this quote: "You can drive the devil out of your garden, but you'll always find him again in the garden of your son." Um, the when I started to to um, to sell my book, I was giving it to somebody who's very kind, and the minute I gave him the book, he immediately gave it to somebody else without reading it. And so I was telling him what it was about, and he said, at a different time when he met me, he'd been thinking about it, and he said, I had a father who, I'll go back to the quote. I had a father. No, first he told me that when he travels, he gets phobic, beyond phobic. He needs to know where he's going and how much it's going to cost and how they're going to get there and what hotel. And he's in a complete panic before he goes and even while he's there. And then he says, my father crossed the ocean when he was 13 in the middle of the night by himself, not knowing where he was going and how he would get there. Do you think that could have anything to do with that story of my father? I said, yes, that's what my book is about. And so I collect these stories. I'm going to ask people at the end if you can think of any I would love to talk some more about these, and you'll see what I'm talking about later on as we go through this. Something might come up in your own thinking that you hadn't quite hit upon but it's there. There's some kind of memory that you've wondered about, whether it's real or whether it isn't. So, so as we're going through this, see if something like that comes up, or if you get a little aha. I have to scroll instead of, how are you, the screen is showing okay here? Because I could do a different view.
Fine.
So I like to talk about resilience as well as trauma, but today we're only going to talk about trauma. What I do want to say about resilience is that that is that is the positive side of what we inherit. We don't just inherit trauma. We're also, we've all born of survivors. We've learned survivorship skills. We've learned resourcefulness. Um, Most of us are in compassionate fields. Um, we're not crazy. We're not broken. We're very sensitive, and we're great. So there's a lot that can be said about resilience as well. Most of what I say is in a book that I wrote, but I'll talk about that later. So I kind of think of it, just the foundational, you know this, but it's nice to see it mapped out. I think of us as having 4 layers of trauma. At the individual level, I don't consider that inherited, because at the individual level, you've had the experience directly. So somebody who's been at a shooting, somebody who's had a suicide in the family, or has been devastated by an economic situation, um, you know, things that happen to you directly is the kind of trauma that gives you PTSD. You can remember it, you have nightmares about it, war vets and those people. Not the same as when you've inherited secondhand, like the second generation. So the survivors are considered first generation, and second generation are the children of survivors. That's most of us in the room. And then our children are third generation, and my grandchildren are fourth generation. So I believe that inherited trauma, I use the word inherited to include all of these, the individual and the generational. Then we have the historical trauma that is external to us and our family. It's events that happen to us through historical situations, like Trump. And collective trauma, which Thomas Hubel talks about a lot, which encompasses all of mankind, and the compassion that we feel collectively, and the hurt that we feel collectively when other people are suffering. So I also have come across the concept of secondary trauma, which means it's the kind of trauma that you would get. It's kind of more like at the individual level. It's somebody taking care, a COVID frontline nurse taking care of dying people. No doubt she will be traumatized, or he, and and that is a form of trauma. It doesn't belong to you individually directly. It's not quite generational. So that's secondary trauma. Now, what's unique about inherited trauma, which encompasses all of them except for the individual, is that it's not of our own making. We didn't experience it directly. Um, it does feel like an original wound, and many of us have felt it from birth, or when we were very, very young. In my case, it's from birth. It also includes another, and it's a difficult part of it, is that includes secrets, undiscussables, unknowns, and I'll talk in a minute about why that happens. So I talked about the first and third generation, second and third and fourth. So because our family, in our generation, I'm assuming that we're all about second generation, we're very sensitive people. We've identified very, very closely with our parents, whatever, some of them are, have been traumatized, some of them have shut down, the different forms of trauma that we've experienced with them. And we were very young. So we didn't quite know intellectually what we were living with, but we sensed it. And how much was talked about, that's another story. We'll talk about that too. So we often created fantasies. We became disassociated to find some safety for ourselves. I know I was a big daydreamer in class. Uh, my parents didn't drive a car. I used to take a bus home, and I'd go into a fantasy world that would I'd end up miles from home. I'd suddenly come to myself. And when we become disassociated from our body, so this attunement process that we do in the Pocket Project is so important to help us tune into our bodies because we have become disassociated. It's also hard for a child to know what is real and what is inherited, and even as adults, it's very hard. So, did I skip up? I can't. I'm having trouble with this because it's scrolling instead of moving. Okay, we're okay. Um, so there's a lot of unresolved generational burdens that we carry, and I'm bringing in today the generations that aren't just victims, but also of and I'm thinking World War II. The context that I'm thinking is World War II, but it could be Indigenous people or African American um, people who've had trauma, or any people. That happens all over the world. But context I'm going to just use is World War II. So in World War II, we have the the people who survived the Holocaust, and they were the victims, and that's where I'm coming from in my family. But there's also children um, of perpetrators, collaborators, the bystanders, and even the rescuers, as I've learned recently, uh, have various traumas that they have dealt with that the kids then inherit from all sides of the table. And there's not a lot of work been done on those issues that those legacies carry. So it could be, the burdens could be um, betrayals, maybe on the part of the rescuers who might, and we all know the Anne Frank story about the betrayal that happened there. It could be survival guilt. It could be other kinds of guilt or shame. Or they might have been heroes, and then it's not a negative um, inheritance; it's a positive inheritance. I know somebody whose parents were partisans in the woods, and they were heroes. So it's a everybody has a very different story, and it's very important um, to process that story. So for for the children of perpetrators, I found this quote that I absolutely love. The challenge of second generation Germans is to not mistake the futility of guilt with the necessary expression of sorrow. So why does history repeat itself? I have a thesis. It started with with an indigenous person who told me, Laura, you might have heard it in your culture, that it takes 7 generations to overcome a trauma. It takes 7 generations for the earth to replenish. If you put a crop in and don't replenish it after 7 years, um, it won't be able to produce the crop anymore. It has to rotate, it has to change. 7 generations apparently comes up in the Bible in various ways. And from everything that I read, it just struck me that 7 generations seems to be the right amount. However, I believe that if it isn't acknowledged and processed and talked about, it will take forever. And so, um, somebody who has learned to hate and hasn't thought about it or talked about it or processed it will become a hater, will become a racist, whatever it is, if it's not talked about. And that's why it's so important, the work that we're doing, that Thomas Hubel is doing, that we're giving people an opportunity to actually tune into themselves and into others and process it and integrate it, as the word Thomas Hubel uses. And so it will be perpetuated to the descendants from all those sides that I just talked about. I hate these things, but I'm just going to mention that the reason it's so difficult to deal with inherited trauma is because, and Thomas has done a similar kind of graphic. The thinking part of our brain, the neocortex, and the emotional part of the brain, the limbic brain, they talk to each other and they can communicate and things can happen there. The traumas we're talking about that are so primitive, they call it the dinosaur brain or the reptilian brain, uh, over here in the medulla, um, is very, very deep and very difficult to access, and the other parts of the brain don't talk to it. So our work, that's one of the reasons why our work is so difficult. And my book, everything I talk about is in my book, and more. I've written. Originally, I did my research in the doctorate program, but I wanted people to be able to process their story, and I wanted to help them do that. So it's not a self-help book with prescriptive 1, 2, 3 steps to overcome trauma. It has questions at the end of every chapter that deal with what I talk about in the chapter that you can process through your own story. I hand out journals to people. Um, I believe that writing is a very good way to process your story. Of course, dialoguing in group, the way the Pocket Project is doing, that's what you're doing. So what I'm going to talk about now is knowing the unknowns. As I said, we inherit all these things that we didn't experience directly. And we don't know what we don't know, but we do know. We don't know that we know, and I'm showing you in this part how we might know. One of the things that happened when I first started to do this back in 2009, everybody I talked to, Vietnamese and Black and Indigenous and Jews and everybody, have my best friends are German and Polish. Um, Roland knows my Polish friend just died. Um, so everybody would start with, my mother talked, my father didn't, or my father talked, my mother didn't. Everybody, absolutely everybody. A few people would say they both talked all the time, or they never talked. They were just shut down. But most of the time it was one or the other. So you can think for yourself right now in your own head, who is it in your family that talked and who is it that didn't talk? In my family, it was my mother talked and my father didn't. And I can tell you that I'm trying to find out things about him that are surprising me to this day. I hired a genealogist in Poland, where my parents were from, and I cannot believe what he didn't tell me. um, so the secrets in the family um, could also be in the culture, it could be in the race. I know studying with Black people, there are things that they won't share with their children to protect them. Uh, and then we're the opposite. So why do families not tell their children? Um, Obviously, the first answer is to protect them. The racial silencing is about protecting them from, like Anita Hill. I don't know if everybody knows the Anita Hill who charged somebody with a judge, very famous case in the United States, with sexual assault. And it was not something a Black person would dare accuse somebody else of. It was actually a Black judge, but um, they would just get into trouble. So they were taught to be quiet, not to speak. Um, we have various, very subtle messages when we grow up about what can be talked about and what can't be talked about. And of course, out of guilt and shame, in my father's case, um, his wife, he had left his wife and two children. His wife had said to him that he better run because they thought that the men were going to be put in labor camps. They didn't know that the women and children would be killed. He did find out at some point, try to get back, and was arrested. I never got the story whether he was arrested by the Polish army or by the Germans or by the Russians. Have no idea. But I know that till the day he died, he was ashamed of himself. And he asked me before he died, "Am I a good person?" I knew what he meant. Um, and I just found out from the genealogist that it's actually written in the record that he deserted the family. That was quite a shock. Um, in many cases, families just want to get on with life. So they're now living in a different place. You know, borders have changed. They've immigrated. They want to they want to start a new life. In many cases, it's quite odd. I've seen this in my family. Um, in a war situation or in a displacement situation, one of the spouses has died and the other one has survived, and they've married a new person. In my parents' case, my parents met in Uzbekistan, and after the war, my mother was ready to leave if they found out his wife was alive, but they found out she wasn't. And they married not out of love like my father did with his first wife. They married out of just for survival. It was very necessary for couples to get together and help each other. And in fact, my father at one point was in a Russian jail with malaria, and she bribed the judge to get him out. So there's all these survival stories that happened, but there was no real love between them. They were quite a misfit. They came from different parts of Poland and very not suited to each other, but they don't talk about their other life. And so, and so they numb the pain. One of the reasons they numb the pain and don't talk is to avoid the nightmares and to avoid the guilt and the shame. And then I'm also discovering, with DNA tests, people are finding out that their father isn't their father, their mother isn't their mother, their siblings are different. This seems to be happening a lot. So those are family secrets. Then there's national and global secrets. So after the war, the Germans became the allies. They became the good guys. With Russia, we ended up in a Cold War, whereas at the beginning they were pretty good. And so histories get reconstructed. Information is covered over. Very, very hard to get information. Um, I hear stories about events that just drive me crazy. This one in particular does. They have a whole story about why in Hungary, they didn't bomb the railway tracks. Uh, by then, they all knew about gas chambers. They all knew, I mean, they were out there fighting, and they could have bombed those railway tracks to stop Hungarians to be moved into the gas chambers, and they didn't do it. And they will tell you now, a guide said that to me in Venice when we were talking about something, that it was a tactical requirement not to give away their war strategies. So they didn't bomb those railway tracks. They were actually people in the gas chambers in the concentration camps came and spoke to Churchill and spoke to Roosevelt. This is all documented, begging them to even bomb the concentration camps. By then, the people were half dead anyway. Churchill was ready to do it. Roosevelt wouldn't do it. Um, and um, and as a result, like 90% of Hungarian Jews were killed. 565,000 people were killed. There's funny stories about Roosevelt, same guy again, who considered a big hero, but not to me, who also put out edicts on what kind of Hollywood movies can or can't be made. So there actually weren't there were musicals were made at that time by the Jewish directors who weren't allowed to do anything else, but they figured if they did musicals, they would make money on it, which they could send to the Jews in Europe to help them. But it was a long time before Jews were allowed to be seen in those situations. So another reason, another thing that happens that's, oh wait, yeah, I thought I missed something. There are different forms of memories that we can have despite the hidden secrets. So we have the family stories that people tell us. Um, we have photographs, some of us don't. Um, there is a form of memory that I learned from in Israel from a professor in Haifa who described something that she called silent or present memory. You know things by the daily behaviors that you see in your house. So, and my mother, of course, didn't throw out food, and I've learned that as well. That tells you that they knew hunger. Um, my mother, in her old age, wouldn't allow to have her shoes taken off. She went to sleep in her, she had a bit of dementia. She wouldn't allow anybody to touch her shoes. And then I realized, back in the war, you needed shoes to run, and that tells you something. So there's things that you don't normally think about, but when you put it together, you can fill in some blanks and create a story behind that. Um, diasporic memory, diaspora means displacement, is it's a kind of a haunting memory. I can't go into details, but it's in my book about this kind of memory, which feels like you're there. Um, and then there's a memory that happens afterwards that you will find in photos and films and arts and monuments that we have all around us. And I think it's wonderful that we do have these memorials. It's very important. It's also very important to have these for validation purposes. One of the ways to move forward from trauma is to be validated. And that's why group dialogues are so important, because you get that validation in those group dialogues. So I have no problems with museums and would love to see even more um, of those things. Now, this concept is much more complicated and really fascinating. And some people call it phantom memory. Um, this happens, I can use my father as a description here. When the parent splits off an unintegrated part and the sensitive child takes it on. So I could sense this guilt and shame that my father had. And I would try to fix it. So we need to find a way to convert that parent's suffering, and we're very sensitive to it. Where do I have it next? What happens, yeah, I'll just move it to here. Alice Miller wrote a wonderful book that I'm putting up because it was just a game changer for me, called The Drama of the Gifted Child. It explains why family dysfunction goes on from generation to generation. When a child over-identifies with the parent's traumatic experiences, the child is rescuing the parent, tries to rescue the parent from their suffering. So they'll imagine going through what the parent went through. They almost relive what they went through. The problem is that the child doesn't get to be a child. And so they grow up with this big empty void, having been this little adult all the time and never having a childhood. Their child, according to Alice Miller, their sensitive child. In a family, there's always one. Not everybody is this. I have a friend of mine whose granddaughters are twins. And one twin is obsessed with the Holocaust and asks her questions all the time, and the other one, nothing. So when she talks about the gifted child, to me, the gifted child is that sensitive child. That they have a child who's gifted and sensitive and notices the void in their parent. And then they do the same thing and try to fill up their parents' void and rescue them. Um, and then, of course, they grow up with that void, and then that child continues it. So you can see a generational transmission. So here's a quote: "Children of survivors aim to redeem their parents' suffering, not only to rescue their parents from the horrifying black hole, but to create a more coherent historical and personal foundation for their own emotional well-being. By virtue of embodied syndrome and memories, these offspring earn the legitimate status of authentic wounded survivors." It's sad, but it's beautiful. Now, what I was wondering about when I was doing this slide was, so we're talking about parents who were victims. I'm wondering what this means for children of inheritors of perpetrators or collaborators or even bystanders. I'm wondering how I'm doing for time. Okay. When I was in the Netherlands, the first time I went to the Netherlands, so I'm coming from Canada, where people are not aware of the war here. But in Europe, wasn't aware until I was visiting there. My PhD was with Tau's Institute in Tilburg University in Tilburg in the Netherlands. So I'd go there for workshops. And I was staying at a Airbnb, and I was telling the guy who was running it what I was studying. And he got this look of guilt across his face that I have never seen. I never, in a non-Jew, I didn't know what it was. And he could hardly speak. He said, "We lost too many people. It should never have happened." And he might have been, in a family of bystanders, which many were, um, and would have and would be suffering. Um, I was very happy to come across this guy, Sandor Ferenczi, The Dream of the Clever Baby, because he validated my sense of the wise child. He believes that the young child is familiar with much knowledge that later becomes buried by the force of repression. I believe that we're born with knowledge, and I'll tell you why. So I have had an inherited memory, and I still have it. It's in my body. I have had a felt sense of knowing something I could not know. What it was about my father's two children that were killed. This is a Vietnamese quote: "Brothers and sisters are as close as hands and feet." It helped me very much when I was actually finally grappling with this whole concept, because I knew when I was very, very little that they had been shot in the back. My father had talked about them. And I had the spot on my back, and I still do. It's right in the middle of my back. And if anybody would touch me to wake me up, I would just jump. I just always had this icky feeling in my back, and it just, I knew they were shot. When I was a little older, I asked my father, how did they die? And he said, "We have no way of knowing." And I was so puzzled. I said, "What are you talking about? They were shot, weren't they?" And, "Well, no, we have no way of knowing." I could not figure it out. It was just so obvious to me. But he said, no, they didn't know. It wasn't, how do I describe this? It wasn't until I actually started to research historically dates and times of what would have happened. So I came across this fact, and I became a mad researcher, as many people do, and a lot of our cohort in the Pocket Project, we're all a little bit mad. we become a little obsessive. I found out that Krakow, where my father was from, was the first ghetto ever built. And when I looked at the year and I had found out when gas chambers were built, I knew that gas chambers hadn't been built yet. So if his family went into the Krakow ghetto in 1940 and gas chambers hadn't been built, I also learned that children under 5 were immediately killed and no records were kept because all the databases I could find out nothing about them, not even a birth date. Um, so so there were no gas chambers, so they didn't go to concentration camp with gas chambers. They were shot. That's what would have happened. They would have been shot. So it was only in the last, 7 years or so that I finally got that validation that indeed they were shot. I'm still working on that. Um, and another odd thing that has happened to me at my age now. So I have spinal stenosis, which is a compression of the spinal discs, and it compresses on arteries and nerves, and it's going to cause me a lot of problems. And it does now. I've got a very curved back. I'm not exaggerating. 4 months ago, no, just before the coronavirus hit, about 6 months ago, I went to a nerve conduction doctor, and he was looking at my MRI. And we had really hit it off. He was a great guy. And he said, Gita, you've had this since you were born. And I said, yep, I'm not surprised. Probably even before I was born. And I told him my story. He thought I was the most fascinating thing he'd heard. So strange, isn't it? I have actually had this since birth. It's as if I've incorporated the children through my father. I don't, I wouldn't know how to explain it. So that was Helena and that was Henush. I now, through this genealogist, know that she was born in 37 and that he was born in 37 and she was born in 40, and there's a 3 years age difference. For some reason, my father had said they were 1 year apart, but I could see from these two pictures. Thank God that we have these pictures. I've only just figured out why I even have pictures. My father actually had quite a lot of pictures. I figured out, so I was born in a displaced persons camp in 46. I figured out that after the war was over and my parents left Uzbekistan, they must have come through Krakow to find out if his wife was alive or not. Children would not have been. And so he would have gone back home and gotten these pictures. And then what I figured out, my mother tells this miserable story about how mean my father was to her at the DP camp. So they had arrived and she had no belongings and they had food stamps. It was a very nice DP camp in Wasserburg, Germany, one of the fewer nice ones. And they had just arrived and he's playing cards with his buddies. And she's feeling very dismissed and asks him if he wants her to just leave or what. And he says, I don't care what you do. Continues playing cards all night with his buddies. So what a bastard he is. Terrible, terrible. When I started to figure out when they had gone into the DP camp, I realized he's just found out that his children were actually killed and he's about to have a daughter. I had once done this trauma test where this person pulls down on your arm and very quickly rhymes off all the before birth and all the years of your life. And she said my first trauma was in my mother's last trimester of pregnancy. And I finally figured out what that meant when I started to put these years together, that sure, my mother was traumatized at that time, and that my father was about to have a child when he just found out that 2 of his children had been killed. So I can't imagine what both of them went through. And it's so incredible that I'm so bloody tenacious, as Marielle knows, that I went through all this work to find this information out. It's actually quite appeasing. So any questions?
Gita, I'm sorry, I'm not clear. Do you mean about what we have heard before and you're going to continue with the presentation, or do you
Yeah.
mean
Oh,
now?
sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. We're going to move into the practice soon, uh, and we're going to just change venue. So I'm going to stop talking and doing a presentation, and I'm going to introduce what we're going to be doing next. So in terms of knowing the unknown, this part of it, are there any questions for the whole thing?
Gita, this is Linda. I don't have a question, it's a comment. I just really want to thank you. I've been doing a very, very deep dive into the Red Book by Carl Jung and my own history with war trauma, and it's part of the PhD that I will be writing. I'm just at the end of my core coursework. It's the last paper before starting the dissertation. And it can feel a little bit lonely, and you've really just met because as you said, you can go down some rabbit holes and deep dives, and it's material I've worked with quite a long time, but I had a mentor. So I just want to thank you. And boy, your siblings are just beautiful children. I need to comment, I'm just really moved and touched to discover, such beautiful children. And, a lot of what I want to bring forward is, the tragic loss of life because of this unresolved trauma. And I'm just really touched by your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I can't say that that I'm sorry about all of this, about this trauma that I've got. I actually embrace it. I think it's made me a better person. I think that the sadness that I have is nothing wrong with it. It's worthy. I call it cherished burdens that I carry. They're burdens, but I do cherish them. And when I went to Hiroshima, oh, I should have found that quote. When I went to Hiroshima, it's a very similar story. And I saw a quote by a mother who lost her little boy saying that she's alive so that he could live through her. So we have a purpose that's important and good. So I don't think that the trauma that I have is terrible at all. I think I'm fine with it. Thank you, Linda. So the reason
Susan,
I'm bringing.
sorry, Gita. Susan, do you have a question?
I do, but I mean, I don't have to take it right now, but it seemed to follow on, Gita, to what you were talking about purpose. That's why the question came up for me again. And I know this is probably more in the realm of your resilience, inherited resilience, but I would just love to hear a brief overview of your findings about what allowed people to move through their trauma and not have it be embedded in their bodies. And if you have some stories, or an overview of that.
Well, I'm still working on that because my body is suffering, and I haven't been in touch with my body. So I think it is hard work, and actually, what we're about to talk about is one way to get at it. It's hard work because because we haven't experienced it directly, and so much of it is embedded. I'm about to talk about art. I'm very much appeased by beautiful art and by song and music and jokes and movies. I just watched an Ingmar Bergman movie. The beautiful thing about art is that not only, I love this quote, we have art in order not to die of the truth. It's true. I mean, we would otherwise just not be able to tolerate what's going on in the world now. and what our families have gone through. So all of these venues that we find for ourselves, some people it's sports, nature, and there's we all find different ways. If we don't, the number of addictions, I saw an incredible statistic showing the different uh, reasons for death. It was this fast moving chart with HIV at the top and then going down and things moving and moving, and then the coronavirus moving up to the top. The second one that was steady the whole time was suicides. We have an incredible amount of suicides. Just saw that this morning. And, I've listened to Gabor Mate a lot talk about addictions and suicide. The reasons, from what I can gather, is that the addictions happen because of stress and trauma. So if we don't find those places of resilience and beauty that we can that can help us deal with that trauma, we do end up with lots of addictions. There's so many addictions our society is full of. Obesity, it's not just drugs, it's all kinds of things, a lot of alcohol. Facebook has become an addiction. So I don't know if I'm answering that question directly. Was there something else you were looking for?
No, you mentioned purpose. I
Oh,
imagine that purpose is a way forward to be able to make
yeah,
sense of the unknown, perhaps, or the things
yeah.
that.
And the journey is the purpose. The purpose doesn't end up at the end of the journey. The whole journey is the purpose. So really, your whole life, the meaning that you give to your life, and the journey that you decide to take, it, it can be helpful, but it certainly takes a lot of courage. I think courage, and I think we've learned that resilience. I've inherited that from my mother. Boy, she was a force of nature and difficult as hell. And I didn't like her, but I learned that from her. So let me talk to you about, we're going to be writing poetry. Some of you may already not find that new, and a lot of you might find it a little, maybe not something you want to do, but I will convince you that it is a wonderful thing to do, to get at your unknowns and to let go of some repressed anger, to get in touch with your feelings, to get in touch with your thoughts. And I came across this interesting quote that in Shakespeare's time, poetry was not meant to be interpreted, but to be experienced as a window to the world. It was very natural in that time for people to be talking in verse and going to plays that were written by Shakespeare, that were very poetic. I had run a poetry workshop in Vancouver. I met Roland at that time. It was a 3-day workshop, and on my second day, I had them write poetry. Their poetry was so good that they created this little book. For those people who didn't want to write poems, I did allow them to cut pictures out of a magazine. But I want to read a poem out of it. They were so proud of themselves, and the book is just great. Beautiful, beautifully done. This one woman in the group, she was 80 years old. She had cancer on her head. She was very elegant, and she wore a black bowler hat on the top of her head. And I was walking around the room as people were writing their poems, and if they needed help, I'd stop and listen. And she said, "I've written a poem, but I can't read it to the group." And I said, "That's okay. You don't have to read it." And she said, "I hated my mother. I hated her. And this is the poem I wrote. I said, do you want to read it to me? And she said, okay. So really, really an amazingly well done poem. And I said that to her. It was very impactful, very powerful. The next morning she came in and she said, I worked on it for hours last night and I'm ready to read it to the group. Did she ever get validation? I have to read this just to show you what somebody can do in such an honest way. So it's called, What Was She Thinking? What was she thinking? Why did she have 3 children who pressured her? Who pressured her? Her taste in clothes, that ill-fitting red polyester pantsuit. Didn't she realize she couldn't sew? Yet she always sewed in that tiny space in the basement, filled to the gills with my father's junk. Seeing her dead as a doornail in the Hevra Kadisha, it's a Jewish funeral, her scalp showing through her thin hair. I never liked her, never for 1 second. She felt the same toward me. I took her out for lunch once. She ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a peanut butter banana sandwich. So that's a poem, and that's a great poem. Give you an idea what we're looking for. So I'm going to teach you very quickly what a poem is all about. And you've learned this in high school. So it usually will have either a simile or a metaphor. A simile is when you compare something with another and you use the word like or as. So her smile is like the stars above. She is as gentle as an angel. In a metaphor, you leave out the like or as. So instead of she is as gentle as an angel, she is an angel. Onomatopoeia, you might have forgotten what that means, and I'll give you some examples. That's where the sound reflects the meaning. You'll see in a minute. Alliteration is when a letter is repeated over and over again. Like bumble and fumble, that wouldn't have the similar sound. You can have spaces. So I'm going to show all of these to you for emphasis and to reflect meaning. The trick that I tell people from my own experience, doesn't come from any expertise, but my own, is that when you're writing, cut out the extraneous stuff and you'll find that what will emerge will be the core, and you might not even expect it. I had a friend come over and I said, you want to write a poem? She had no idea how to start, and she wrote a 2-page essay on something. I said, that's perfect. And we'll cut from there. And we cut and we cut and we cut. And it ended up being about a poem about being alone on a boat, far from where she really was. So I'm also going to talk to you about haiku poems. So we have the traditional poetry that I just described. Haiku is, and I was just talking to Kazuma a bit about haiku poems. In a few words, it captures a moment and creates a picture. It's kind of like a window into a scene much longer than itself, because here it is in little 3 lines, and you get this beautiful scene coming out of it. Now, I write haiku poems and I do the 3 lines, but I don't follow the 5 syllables in the first line, 7 syllables in the second, and 5 in the third. But I just want to let you know that that's the traditional style. The third line, which I do, is also called, and apparently this word is used for different parts, kireji. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Kazuma. So the third line has a kind of a wonder and a surprise, and I've done tons of those, and they're really fun. So here's one that I wrote. I did write a poetry book as well, a compilation of my poems throughout my life. So this one is, ladies and gentlemen, you have lost the wrestling match because you fight dirty. They're often funny too. So you can see the surprise turn there. This one I wrote, peace doesn't cost anything. It just needs good humor and a round table. Now, this poem I wrote, and I'm pulling out the metaphors and the similes here. So it's called Inherited Trauma, Cherished Burdens. The invisible child, metaphor, with her invisible memories, is another one. Silently carrying the weight of history, silently carrying the weight of her parents' suffering, silently carrying the weight of the world's suffering. You can see the S's and the W's being repeated there. Without resentment, she carries the torch for her ancestors. Metaphor. Her sadness and resilience will create a better world, will serve as a mantle, metaphor, simile, protecting future generations. She smiles knowing she is strengthened, again we S's, by her ancestors, more S's, knowing she can say yes to life. This one I wrote in my 20s, and I was really in a desert. This really happened. I call it Cleanliness is Next to Godliness. And what I want you to notice here is the spacing. The courtyard needs sweeping, but the courtyard's in the desert. Sweep on, and until eternity then. Yes, sir. You can see how that, and E. E. Cummings used to do a lot of that with spaces. This one I wrote when I was 17 and a friend of mine died. And I don't know where it came from, but I had this image. And what's interesting here in the spacing is the word still and why. Long shadow on my short tomb, still beats the heart. Now that still could be, oh, it's still beating, or it's still, so it's not beating. Still as a moment, a still moment, or it's continuing. Long shadow on my short tomb, even I don't understand this poem, still beats the heart, flies to the one-eyed moon. I love that image of the one-eyed moon. Why the warriors weep below? And the why could be, why do the warriors weep below? Or it could be an exclamation. Why the warriors weep below? Like, which would accept that they're weeping, or that would question that they're weeping. And the other thing is that still is in a still part of the poem, as well as having that meaning of still. Now this one is onomatopoeia. How are we doing for time? Okay, almost done. So I wrote this when I first started working in the government, the bureaucrat. And it's the awe sounds that you'll hear. The Ottawa waspland, awesomely mundane, pathetically cowardly afraid, doing its rounds around and around. Makes you want to yawn. So I'm going to ask you in the next 15 minutes to write a poem in any style and see what emerges. My counsel to you is to trust yourself, trust the process. It will emerge as it should. And don't forget to cut. So write freely, whatever comes out, and then cut. And then you'll find some edits, some additions, some changes. But think about cutting after you've done something very quickly. I'll leave this up so you could remember. And if anybody needs help, I can give you a word now. I can give you a couple of words that you can start with, and you'll see that you really don't need to know them. So how about when I, or if, what else was I thinking? I could hear. So you're better off to just do this on your own, because anything I give you is not really going to work. So you've got 15 minutes. If people finish earlier, let us know. Just unmute yourself and let us know. 4 more minutes. Okay, everybody. I'm sure it's perfect as it is, or you can work on it some more. I invite you all to unmute yourself. We're going to self-manage. Unmute yourself. When you're ready to share your poem, it would be lovely to hear. So just speak up.
I wonder if we might go back, if we stop sharing your screen so that we can see each other.
Oh. So I have to take that down. Got it. Oh, perfect. Thank you. Any brave one to go first?
I'm happy to go first.
Okay.
So this one, oops, sorry. This one is called 1913, and just for context, the Mexican Revolution started in 1910. And it says, she was 10 when she left home. Did she go herself? Was she taken? Was she sold? Hell within and around. Terror. Silence. Silent rage. Shattered soul folded. Inside an indomitable will. Blossom of your blossom, I weep for you.
Mm,
Thank you.
wonderful.
Hmm.
Thank you. You can unmute yourself, everybody. We want to hear the applause. Yay!
Yay!
Thank you, Laura. That was amazing.
I'll go next. I wrote a short kind of haiku initially, and then it carried on. So it's kind of got two parts. So walking on this path, my feet recognize the land. I once belonged here. And then I carried on with, all is not well, something is wrong. Here the only place I can be a wish to fly away. I know history hidden, feel it in my bones, all is not well. So long ago, the whisper of the old tree known to me, each thread restoring.
Thank you. Wonderful. I love the haiku sitting by itself as well. They both work. It works together as well as by itself. Fantastic. Beautiful.
So sorry, Susan, you're going to leave soon. Did you want to go? Sorry, can't hear.
I'm sorry. You know how you enter and you think you're spacing, and it entered before it was, but I'll give you my blessing. This is my haiku blessing. May beauty and joy replace the burdens you should never have carried.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Wonderful.
I'll go next. So this is called self-compassion. Waving goodbye as a simple gesture. Beneath the wave, no simplicity implied. Gesturing a commitment she could not deny. Taken on without consent. An honor, heaven sent. Waving goodbye.
Oh, wonderful. Complicated too.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yay. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I need to hear it again.
Yeah, can you read it again?
Me too. I need to do it again.
Okay. So I called it self-compassion, but it's waving goodbye as a simple gesture. Beneath the wave, no simplicity implied. Gesturing a commitment she could not deny. Taken on without consent. An honor, heaven sent. Waving goodbye.
Wow.
So it's about my own sense of inherited trauma from my mother. So my mother's guilt and shame, which I didn't understand, and then I've lived a life of guilt and shame, trying to work out what I'm ashamed about and guilty for. So it's about waving for me, waving that goodbye.
Nice, nice.
Beautiful.
Thanks.
Bye, Susan.
Bye.
Thank you, Jill. Can I go next because I have another meeting at 4:30 as well? And my poem is inspired by a session I had yesterday, and it's similar to Jill's, a recognition that I'm carrying something of my mother's that's not mine, that's my mother's. So this is my poem. Pressing in my throat, pulling up my face, my mother back turned, frozen, frenzied, keep walking.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
I like the F's, the alliteration in there. Yeah, I'd like to hear all of these or see these. Maybe we could have them.
Gather them together. Yes, I'd be happy to. So if everybody could send them to me, I'd be happy to send it to all of us and to you, Geeta, also.
Yeah, I'd love to see them.
Yes.
Anybody else?
I'm going to go next also because I also have to leave at 4:30. I have somebody waiting for me already. It came out of the spur of the moment. I don't think it's within the context as much as I don't know where it came from, like you said, but it's more not in what you have shared today, I believe.
Sure.
Or it could be, I don't know.
You don't know.
It's not following anything other than it's full of spaces, which I will send to Laura and then she can share
Okay.
it that way. And so, does the inquiry persist? Why? If there's a question, then duality? Is it all one? Or is that still a question? No is swallowed up in a yes. So it is. That's it.
Yeah,
Thanks.
beautiful.
Wonderful. I can
Thank
see the
you.
spaces, like
Yeah,
the
it's full of
spaces.
spaces.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much. It's been so enlightening.
Yeah.
Gee, thank
Wonderful.
you.
Wonderful. Keep doing, keep writing poetry.
Thank you.
So we're almost at the end
Hi,
of our
Barbara.
time for today for our seminar. And I just want to thank you so much, Geeta, for the richness of what you have brought to us and for the beauty of this practice that you invited us to engage in. It feels like this has been a really enriching and nourishing space to be able to look at this together. So thank you so much.
Thank you. You were brave for doing this too. And it worked out very beautifully. You did wonderfully well. Wonderful. I'm very gratified. Thank you.
So glad. And thanks everybody for
Thank
showing
you,
up.
everybody. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you,
for bringing
Gita.
questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Roland.
Yes.
Thank you, Gita. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Gita.
I just want to say thank you to those who have watched this because, you know, speaking into a future, you know, and if anybody who has watched this and wants to write and send me also this, I'd be happy to forward it to Gita as well. So those of you who are wanting to stay on with us for our meeting,